Hello friends, I hope that your day is going well, which is a slightly odd sentiment considering I'm probably not aware of your individual existence if this video goes well. So, I was scrolling through Instagram the other day and I came across an Amnesty International reel where they said that autistic people were disproportionately likely to be referred to Prevent, which is a counter-terrorism organisation in the UK. So, being the nerdy wackadoodle that I am, I did a deep dive and that is what we are going to be talking about today. In November 2023, Amnesty International's report, This is the Thought Police, examined the effect of Prevent on human rights. One of the questions they asked was, is Prevent discriminatory? Amnesty talked about three groups that were overrepresented in referrals: Muslims, children, and neurodiverse people. Looking through their footnotes, I noticed a narrative about autistic people developing in the security apparatus of the United Kingdom over the last few years. So, to start with, in July 2021, Jonathan Hall KC, who is the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, said that there was a staggeringly high number of autistic people who are referred to Prevent, and that there had been insufficient public attention because of, and I quote, a very real and respectable fear that it would lead to stigma. The Guardian article in which these remarks are reported follows Hall's narrative as he goes on to list examples of autistic people who have been convicted of terrorism-related offences. The problem is, as he sees it, autism plus, i.e. autism and unstable family background, or autism and cognitive difficulties. And then he goes on to emphasise why the criminal justice system might not be the best way to deal with this, and it's more of a social problem. Now, this has the air of something progressive, the idea that we shouldn't just solve our problems by putting people in prison for years, and that we should try to help people rather than punish them where possible, and account for mitigating circumstances. However, at no point does the Guardian article, or Hall in his lecture, suggest that there might be something wrong with the referral system. This, I think, is another example of survivorship bias in our system, and misreporting. Evidently, where there are autistic people who have cognitive difficulties, or an unstable family background, they are interacting with social workers and doctors far more than the average neurotypical person. Furthermore, Hall's remarks also do not account for scientific studies which have investigated in detail the relationship between autism and the likelihood to commit terrorist actions. Al-Attar 2020 specifically investigated how autistic traits can make people vulnerable and or resilient to radicalisation, looking at push and pull factors. Whilst the discussion is certainly interesting, to avoid being tangentially lured over there, the important part is the conclusion. Al-Attar is very clear. Autistic spectrum disorder does not constitute a risk factor for terrorism in the general population, and even in terrorist offenders with an ASD diagnosis, there is no evidence to suggest that ASD plays a causal role. He also concluded that each individual's autistic traits will have different nuanced push and pull effects, and that ASD is diverse, and its heterogeneity means that you can actually use autistic traits to diminish risks of radicalisation, although this would be different for each individual person. Despite modern research stating that an autistic person is no more likely to be radicalised than anyone else, the narrative has continued to build that there is some link between autism, Asperger's syndrome, and terrorism. In July 2022, the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament uses Hall's talking points in their report on extreme right-wing terrorism, developing the idea further. They took evidence from a member of the Homeland Security Group who testified that anecdotally, most Prevent coordinators say that they see a link between autism and right-wing extremism, and that it is the regular report from the ground, as it were. Now, this contributor caveats their remarks by saying that they would be almost unanimously rebuked by mental health professionals, and that the samples that they have in prisons that might provide evidence to support the idea are far too small to be statistically significant. Nevertheless, the parliamentary report, as part of their conclusion, stated that without an agreed understanding of the links between extreme right-wing terrorism and the developmental disorders, Asperger's and autism spectrum disorders, it is difficult to see how this problem can be tackled effectively. Notice again that Parliament does not question that there is a link between autism and extremism, only that it is ineffable. In the government's response to this report, published the following March, the caveats and rebukes from the mental health professionals are dropped. The government doubled down on highlighting the importance of coordinating policy between the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Social Care in order to improve understanding of a link between terrorism and autism, which doesn't exist. So, by the time Suella Braverman publishes the UK's strategy for counter-terrorism in July 2023, the government's line is, overall, there is limited evidence to support a direct causal link between mental health or neurodivergence and an individual's terrorist threat or susceptibility to radicalisation. So, if there is no link between autism and extremism, why does the British government think there is? Why are there so many more neurodivergent people being referred to Prevent? Well, Amnesty International suggests that this higher rate of referral is partly due to the empathy problem, which is where we could argue that the effects of neurotypical people's instinctive dislike of autistic people, as demonstrated in Sassen 2017, Al-Khaldi 2019 and Butcher 2023, is a feedback loop inside the security services where doctors, social workers and teachers are referring autistic people to Prevent due to a lack of understanding and communication differences, which is then, because of survivorship bias, creating an artificial link between autism and extremism, especially right-wing extremism. Amnesty International highlights one case to show how a Prevent referral can be ridiculous. In October 2021, Connor, who was then 24, who is ADHD with learning difficulties and pathological demand avoidance, was referred to Prevent. Alongside the somewhat red flag of looking at anti-trans websites, Connor's social worker provided a number of other reasons for reporting him to Prevent, including that he liked anime, his taste in music, he watched pornography, and that him liking the game Warhammer was representative of militarism. The police dropped their referral in December of that year, but Connor and his family weren't informed by the local authority for over a month, in which time they feared Connor would be arrested, and Connor, who needed close care, was without a designated social worker for months. The independent review of Prevent by William Shawcross, released in early 2023, also provides another explanation. That in areas without sufficient social services, specialist clinics or support for learning difficulties, autistic and ADHD children are being referred to Channel as an alternative method of getting the support they need. For context, Channel is a panel designed to intervene early to prevent terrorism and to protect individuals who might be vulnerable or at risk. Essentially, because of austerity, in a desperate bid to get neurodivergent children the support they need, social workers are referring children to a safeguarding program designed to stop people being recruited by terrorists. This would put neurodivergent children on Prevent's radar and feed into the institutional idea that neurodivergent children are more vulnerable to extremist ideas. Shawcross also pointed out that while theoretically some individuals with psychological or social difficulties may be susceptible to the influence of extremists in individual cases, there isn't a consensus on the link between mental illness and terrorism, and historically, terrorist groups like the IRA or Al-Qaeda have purposely avoided recruiting individuals who presented with psychological difficulties. Shawcross stated, in my view, those with mental health issues or complex needs are significantly overrepresented within Channel, and that Prevent is overly focused on issues such as mental health and social isolation as drivers of radicalisation. Another report found in Amnesty's footnotes is a 2020 report from the charity MedAct called False Positives. False Positives investigated how Prevent interacted with the healthcare system and found that the stigma around mental health conditions meant that 4 mental health trusts were making similar numbers of referrals as 18 other NHS trusts between 2017 and 2019. They theorised that this was partly due to common schemas connecting terrorism to poor mental health in popular media. This demonstrates a broader problem in how Prevent functions. In short, this is a complete system failure. The government, Parliament, security services are all investing resources and time to counter extremism in the group of people who are no more likely than any other to be radicalised or engage in terrorism, because the state has consistently, over the last 15 years, kept cutting social services and not investing enough in healthcare. It is a series of Chinese whispers started by Aeolian tones. This misinformation that has been created inside government will continue to affect neurodivergent people for years, as institutionally one of the most marginalised, misunderstood and poorest socioeconomic groups has been portrayed as a potential national security threat. Now, I would like to touch on another point in how these organisations are discussing autism and neurodivergence. Whilst Amnesty International have done a great job highlighting the inaccuracies and false conclusions in the government's assessment in the data, they fall into the same trap as the government. They use the terms mental health and neurodiversity interchangeably, when these are not synonymous. They cite a report from MedAct, which talks a lot about high referral rates of mentally ill people and the serious ethical problems around it, but this report does not have the word autism or neurodiversity in it. I only discussed it above to highlight a wider problem in how the government views vulnerable people as threats. Similarly, in Parliament's Intelligence and Security Report, they also subsume autism under the subheading of mental health. In paragraph 83, they discussed an incident of a mass stabbing relating to loud noises, before going on to talk about autism in the next paragraph without drawing a clear line between mental health and autism or wider neurodiversity, leading not only to misinformation but borderline fear-mongering. Likewise, the government's response to that report, when only mentioning Asperger's syndrome and autism spectrum disorder, manages to conflate mental health with developmental disorders, another term for neurodiversity which has its own problems for obvious reasons. So, you may think I'm being a bit pedantic here, but it's really important. Autism is not poor mental health. ADHD is not poor mental health. Neurodiversity is not another word for mental health. Nor is it the same thing as learning difficulties. These things can overlap. As I said in the last video, depression and anxiety amongst neurodivergent people is incredibly high. But that is the effect of years and decades of a square peg being smashed in order to fit a round hole. And as I said in the misinformation episode, the high rate of learning difficulties are completely overestimated by underdiagnosis and survivorship bias, and are probably also not helped by the vague definition of learning difficulties. Autistic people do not require curing, we require acceptance. It's a basic point. Another thing which is more minor is that repeatedly in these documents, the government and Parliament consistently refer to Asperger's syndrome, despite the research of Hans Czech and Edith Schaefer demonstrating his complicity in Actian T4, a program which systematically murdered disabled people. Which I think shows that when writing all these reports, they didn't really do a deep dive into the modern understanding of autism. They were simply following paper trails, because if they did do that deep dive, they would really understand the insensitivity of suggesting that autistic people were more likely to be neo-Nazis when they were a group targeted in the Holocaust. I think I should end the video here, guys. I hope my points come across well. I would really appreciate if you could share this video. It's a serious and important topic, and we need to change some minds. We're not terrorists. I hope you guys have a good day. Goodbye.